everyone, and welcome to the video presentation for Module 13. This video presents non-chord tones. And so the first thing we'll do is define the term non-chord tone. Then we'll work on how to label a non-chord tone as accented, unaccented, or diatonic or chromatic. Then we'll work on how to recognize four types of non-chord tones: passing tones, neighbor tones, suspensions, and retardations. So let's talk about non-chord tones first. A non-chord tone is a note that occurs during a chord, but is not one of the notes of that chord. So in other words, a non-chord tone is simply a note that doesn't belong in the chord. And because non-chord tones are dissonant with all the other notes of the chord, they must be treated with care and always introduced in the proper way. And if this sounds familiar, it is, because this is something that we did when we learned about species counterpoint. So when we were doing second species counterpoint, for example, we were learning how to introduce dissonances and then resolve them. And so if you remember, a dissonance must be created by a step from a consonance, and then it must be resolved by a step to a consonant. So that was an example of a rule that we use to make these dissonances sound like they belong, that they're not abrupt, right? And so in this example of second species, we're creating that perfect fourth dissonance in the second measure by moving up from that third consonance on that downbeat. So, and then afterwards, we resolve that dissonance up a step to become a sixth, which is consonance. So we're always going from a consonance to a dissonance and then to another consonance. And so to remind you of how that sounds, the first three bars of this sound like this. So when we were creating dissonances, we create them by moving up to the dissonance and then resolving that to another consonance. So that's an example of how we handle dissonances, which are similar to non-chord tones. Over here is another example. We're creating a dissonance by moving down from the octave to an interval of a seventh and then resolving that seventh to a consonance of a fifth. And so the sound in that measure would be this. All right, so consonants, move down to a dissonance, resolve to a consonance. So that was one way that we handled dissonances. And it's very similar when we deal with music that has more than two voices. So this is the principle we want to keep in mind, is we always have to introduce this dissonance, which we'll call non-chord tones, in the right way, and then resolve it in the right way. Okay. We also learned about non-chord tones in third species, and this was the one with all the notes, right? In third species, we learned how to connect consonant intervals using dissonant patterns, and we had names for them, right? And those patterns were either called passing tones or neighbor tones. And so an example here in the first measure is of a passing tone pattern, where we start on a unison, D, then the bottom line moves to a passing tone, C, creates a second, and then resolves to a consonant's third. So that passing tone is the dissonant note, which we'll call non-chord tone. Right? But again, they always go from consonants to dissonance to consonants. You can see there's all kinds of different passing tone patterns, some that go up, right? Some that go down. And then we have another non-chord tone pattern, or dissonant pattern, called a neighbor tone, where we go down to a dissonance and then resolve back up. So in that measure, we get this sound. Right? So consonant sixth, and then a dissonant seventh, and then a consonant sixth. Right? So we're always moving between something that is consonant and something that is dissonant, and we get all these different patterns: passing tones or neighbor tones. Okay. Now, when we're dealing with non-chord tones in music that has more than two voices, the principles are really the same. But the non-chord tones are not just dissonances, but they're notes that do not belong in the chord. So they could be dissonances, like they could be a fourth or a third, fourth or a second or something like that, some kind of dissonance, right? But they could also be consonants. Like in some chords, we don't have sixths, but a sixth is not necessarily a dissonance, right? So when we're talking about non-chord tones, we're being really specific to the notes that are in the chord, the notes that should be in the chord, okay? So to find these things, we want to look at our music, and first we want to decide what the chord is, because we need to know what the harmony is supposed to be, what the notes are supposed to be, in order to find the notes that are not supposed to be in that chord, okay? And then after that, we can identify any notes that do not belong in that chord. So I'll play this, and this has two examples of non-chord tones in it. Play that one more time. Right? So in that first chord, if we were to analyze this, first we'd want to know what key we're in. Well, there's one flat, we start on F, so this is definitely the key of F. And that first chord is what looks like an F major triad. So the notes that should be in there are F, A, and C. Okay? The second chord, we have a D, an F, and an A, so that's a D minor triad, which we call 6 in the key of F. And then we have this final chord here, looks like a G, a B flat, a D, and another G. So that is a 2 chord, a G minor chord in the key of F. Okay. Now, if we look at all the notes that are happening while that quarter note chord is being sounded, we'll see that one of these notes does not belong, right? And that would be the note B flat, because in an F major triad, we should only have the notes F, A, and C. We shouldn't have any B flats. So we would identify that B flat, since it doesn't belong in that F major chord, as a non-chord tone, or NCT, okay? And we'll learn what kind it is in a second, but for now it's enough just to say it's a non-chord tone, something that does not belong in that F major triad. Okay, and then there's another one over here, because the only notes that should be in this chord, is this D minor chord, are D, F, and A. And then we'll see while this quarter note is happening, we get a note that does not belong in that chord, which would be this note E in the alto. Okay, so again, that is a non-chord tone. And both of these happen to be dissonant with the other notes around them, but that's not necessarily going to be the case. What really defines them is that they are notes that do not belong in the chord. So let me play that one more time. Okay. And now one other thing to notice is that just like our other dissonant patterns in species counterpoint, these non-chord tones come in between notes that are chord tones, right? And that's usually how these things happen. So this A is a chord tone, right? This B flat is not, but then this A is a chord tone of the next chord. So we get that same pattern of what we would think of as consonants first, dissonance, and then consonants, right? Same thing with this E. The note F here is a chord tone of D minor, but E is not a chord tone of that chord. And then this D is a chord tone of the next chord. So again, we get that same kind of pattern of something that belongs in the chord, something that doesn't belong in the chord, and then something that belongs in the next chord, right? And that's usually how these non-chord tones work. Okay. So let's talk about what different ways that non-chord tones can appear. And the first thing we want to think about is where they are on the beat. So a non-chord tone can be accented if it happens on a beat, okay? And we call it unaccented if the non-chord tone happens on an upbeat. So if we go back to that previous example, both of those are unaccented non-chord tones because both of those happen after the beat, right? So beat 1 is there, and then this is the and of beat 1. So that non-chord tone is unaccented. Same thing with this. The chord happens on beat 2, but this non-chord tone happens on the and of beat 2. So that's an upbeat. So both of these are what we call unaccented non-chord tones. Okay? If they had happened on the downbeat, then we would have called them accented, but they didn't. And then one we're not really going to talk about too much is non-chord tones can be diatonic, which means that the note, the non-chord tone, is still in the key of the music. Or they can be chromatic, which means that the non-chord tone is not in the key of the music. Okay, so it belongs somewhere outside of the key. And we'll talk about more of that in detail, but for right now, we're sticking with mostly diatonic non-chord tones. Actually, we'll just say exclusively diatonic non-chord tones. Okay? All right. So let's talk about the different types. And the first type we're going to talk about is the passing tone. Remember, these have the same names as the species counterpoint ones. So a passing tone is a non-chord tone that is created by a step up or down. Okay, so you move to it either up by step or down by step, and then left by a step in the same direction. Okay, so in other words, they connect two different notes, two different chord tone notes through a note that is not in one of the chords. So here's an example of an ascending passing tone. So we're saying it's ascending because it's going in the upwards direction. Okay, and you'll see that it's in the tenor voice in this case. Okay, so the analysis has already been done here, but we'll see that in this first chord, it's saying it's a 1 chord, which is a D major triad in this key. And so the only notes that we should have in that chord are D, F sharp, and A. But we have a G sounding during all the other notes there, during that chord. So that G is a non-chord tone, and it's an ascending passing tone. So we would identify it as P, T, as passing tone, okay? And you'll see that it moves upwards, like I said, and then is left in the same direction. So we go up to create the non-chord tone, and we keep moving up to connect to the next chord tone, okay? So we call that an ascending passing tone whenever you have a non-chord tone that passes through two chord tones. Okay, now here we have a passing tone in the opposite direction. So we would call this a descending passing tone. Now here we're in the key of G, and let's listen to this. One more time. That one's awesome. Yeah, those are the chord tone there, the descending passing tone. It looks like it connects this note, which is a chord tone, right, to this note here, which is a chord tone. But there's a problem because that happens on the beat. So let's look at the chords and see what belongs in each of them. So in this 4 chord, right, in the key of G, that 4 chord should only have the notes C, E, and G, because it's a C major triad, right? So we should have a C major chord on this beat, right? So the notes that should be in it are C, E, and G. Now we have on the downbeat in the soprano an F sharp. So that F sharp does not belong in that chord. So that is in fact our passing tone. And you can see that it connects this G, which belongs in the 1 chord, with this E, which belongs in the 4 chord. So it's connecting those two chord tones through a dissonance. Now what's special about this one is that this passing tone doesn't happen on an upbeat, it happens on a downbeat. So this is in fact an accented passing tone. Okay, which gives it that distinct sound where it kind of sticks out a little bit more. Which I think is a really nice sound. So we've had 2 different kinds of passing tones, right? And 2 different ways that they can be employed. The first was an ascending passing tone, and it's unaccented because that passing tone was on the upbeat of the first beat of that measure. And then in our second example, we had a descending passing tone because it moves downwards, but the dissonance, right, the non-chord tone happens on the downbeat, so we call it an accented descending passing tone. Okay. All right, let's look at the next kind. And the next kind of non-chord tone is called a neighbor tone, just like in our species counterpoint. So a neighbor tone is a non-chord tone that's created by a step up or down, but then it's left by a step in the opposite direction. So remember, neighbor tones start in one place, but then they go to a new place, but then they come back to where they started. So this example has an example of a neighbor tone in it, and it is in fact an upper neighbor tone. So let's listen to this. Okay, so this is an example of something that doesn't necessarily sound dissonant, but is in fact a non-chord tone, kind of depending on how you look at it. So in this context, there really isn't, there's only 3 voices, so there's a little bit of ambiguity. But if we really look at this chord, right, we have a G, a B flat, and a D, which is a 1 chord in our key of G minor, right? So the only notes that should be in this chord are a G, a B flat, and a D. And so this E flat does not belong in this chord, right? So that's our non-chord tone because it does not belong in the chord. So that's one way of looking at this. However, since that kind of changes what's in this harmony, right? So you could look at this chord as being G, B flat, D, and that's what it is on the downbeat. But once that E flat is introduced, it also kind of looks like G, B flat, E flat, which is also another kind of triad, right? So you could also think about this as being an E flat chord, an E flat triad, when that E flat is introduced. So there's always going to be some kind of ambiguity in some of these. And in this case, you could look at it either way, right? You could say that this is a 1 chord with an E flat as a neighbor tone. Or you could look at it as a 1 chord, and then on this 8th note, it would be a 6 chord, right? An E flat major chord. That'd be major though, right? Because that's what it would be in the key of G minor. And it would just last for that 1/8 note. So there's 2 different ways of looking at that. For our purposes, we're just going to call that a non-chord tone because it does not belong in that initial chord, and it fits better with our lesson we're trying to do. So that one, in fact, is an upper neighbor tone because it moves in the upwards direction and comes back down. So this is a neighbor tone, and specifically, it's an upper neighbor tone. Okay, so upper neighbor tone, whenever you move up and then come back down. And let's look at this next example. And this is one that's in the bass this time. And this is going to be an example of a lower neighbor tone. Okay. So again, we have a 1 chord. Now we're in the key of A, right? So we have a 1 chord to start, and then we move to a what's on here as a 1/6. So 1/6 should have the notes A, C sharp, and, well, I'll put that in, sorry. If we did it in inversion, the lowest note should be a C sharp, an E, and an A, because it's still an A major chord, but just in first inversion. So those are the only notes we should have in this chord, but you'll see that the bass moves downwards to the note B. So that B does not belong in that A major chord, so we have to identify it as a non-chord tone, and in fact this is a lower neighbor tone because it moves down and then goes back up to a chord tone. Okay, and so that's an example that shows you that they can also happen in the bass sometimes. Okay, so those are the 2 basic ones, the passing tone and the neighbor tone. So passing tone connects two different chord tones. Neighbor tones connect or embellish or move from one chord tone back to the same chord tone. Okay, so let's keep going. Now, we talked about another kind of dissonance when we were doing our species counterpoint, and that was in the 4th species. In the 4th species, we learned how to use dissonances called suspensions. Remember, these were things that we held over from a previous harmony so that they would become dissonances in the next bar, right? So that's an example there where this interval starts off as a perfect fifth in the first bar, which is consonant, but when the lower voice moves up to a D, it becomes a perfect fourth, which is a dissonance. And then that needs to resolve down to a consonance. Right? So we had. And that was the point of this species, was creating that dissonant suspension, right? By starting on a consonance, in this case here, a sixth, right? And then holding that over so that the lower voice can move and create a dissonance. Right? So we have our consonant sixth, then a movement to the seventh, right? And then resolve that to a sixth, okay? And we kind of just did that over and over again, and that was what we called fourth species, and this was the process of creating suspensions and resolving them. And just a reminder of how that worked in fourth species, they always follow the same pattern. We prepare first, right? We have a consonance, so some kind of consonant note in the previous bar. Then we hold that consonance over and let the other voice move so that it becomes either a consonance or a dissonance, right? In this case, it's always going to be a dissonance. And then we let that consonance or dissonance resolve to a consonance. But it was always that three-step process of preparing, suspending, and then resolving, right? So here is another example. This time we're in the key of G, where we start with a perfect fifth preparation, right? And then our lower voice moves up so that we get a dissonant fourth, which then resolves to a consonant third. And then so that we could also overlap these. So since that resolution is a consonance, we can use that as the next preparation, right? So then we have our third preparation, which becomes a second when the bottom voice moves, which is dissonant, which can then resolve to a consonant unison in this case. So we have this constant sort of overlapping of this three-step process. Okay, so that was the basics of creating suspensions and resolving them. And it works the same way in 3 or 4 voices. So a suspension is created when a note from a previous chord is held over or repeated in the next chord. Suspensions always resolve down by step. That never changes, okay? And we name our suspensions by the intervals that appear above the bass note, okay? So in this example, we have what's called a 7/6 suspension. And that's because the note that's being held over from the previous chord to create the suspension is a seventh above the bass note. So let me play this. One more time. Okay. So that C, which is a chord tone, in the first chord. So in the first chord, the one chord, that C is a chord tone. That's going to be our preparation, right? So that C is going to be our note of preparation. Okay? Then when it's held over in the next bar, it becomes our suspension when all the other notes move to the new chord, right? So now that C, which was an octave above our bass, is now a seventh above our new bass. So we say it's a 7 suspension, right? And then when it moves to its note of resolution, right, because the seventh is dissonant, it doesn't belong in the chord, it needs to resolve, it moves to a B, which is a sixth above our bass note, right? So that's why we call it a 7/6 suspension, because it's a seventh above the D, but when it resolves, it becomes a sixth above that same D, okay? And in the figured bass, it's written as 7 with a dash, which means to suspend it, right? And then 6, okay? And then, so that's how it always appears. So we call that a 7/6 suspension. Play that one more time. Okay, so let's look at another kind of suspension. This is called a 4-3 suspension for the same reason that the other one's called a 7-6 suspension, because the note that is held over, or in this case, repeated, is a fourth above the bass note, the lowest note. And in this one, we're not holding the note over, we're just repeating it, which is another way that a suspension can be created. Play that one more time. Okay. And so this suspension happens in the same voice as the previous one. That C is a preparation because it belongs in that C major chord, which is on beat number 1. When it's repeated, it then becomes the suspension because it does not belong in that chord. Okay? So then that suspension needs to resolve down to that B, which is the note of resolution. So if we looked at it, that C is a fourth above the bass note G. So we call this a 4 suspension, which then has to resolve down by step to become a third, which is where we get the name 4-3. And again, it appears in the figured bass as this 4-3. Okay. So those are two types of suspensions. Let's look at another kind. So this is called a 9/8 suspension. And for the same reason, because the suspension is a ninth above the bass note. And you can think of a ninth also as a second, right? So second is just a ninth, but with an octave added to it. But we just say 9/8 instead of 2/1 because it's pretty rare to have a unison in this kind of writing, but it's much more common to have an octave. Okay, so we call it a 9/8, and we'll see why. So let me play this for you. Now this suspension is going to be in the tenor voice. Time. I like that one. That's kind of nice. So that D, right, in the 5/6 chord is the preparation because that D belongs in that 5 chord, right, that G major chord. But then when it's repeated, held over, it becomes a suspension because that D does not belong in this chord. And you may have noticed they're no longer eighth notes, right? Because these non-chord tones do not have to be eighth notes. They can also be quarter notes. But if you look at what's happening here, this chord, right, is lasting for a half note. And so within that chord, right, even though this is a quarter note, within this chord, this dissonance is happening. So even though it's not an eighth note like the other ones have been, it doesn't have to be. As long as that note is happening during this chord, it's considered to be a suspension, okay? And so that suspension, that D, is a second or a ninth above the bass note C, so we call that a 9 suspension. And then suspensions always resolve down by step, so that has to resolve down to that C, which is an octave above the bass. So we say this is a 9/8 suspension. And again, written in the figured bass as 9-8. Okay. And then finally, a suspension can also happen in a bass, right? So in this case, we have a suspension happening there. Let's listen to this. One more time. Okay, so here we have a note in the bass that does not belong in what we think of as the chord, okay? It's gonna be a little tricky because usually the bass defines the chord, so you have to be a little bit careful about what you're calling the chord. But if we look at it, you know, first of all, it's labeled 5/6, but if we really looked at the notes here, we see that we have a D, a G, and another D, and then right on the downbeat we have this note C. Now there's no chord that has a C, a D, a G, and a D, right? So that's just not a chord. It's not a triad. So that C cannot be part of that chord because those other notes don't work with that, right? But if we look at the next note, the eighth note, we'll see that it's a B. And we do have a chord that is B, D, and G, right? That's our 5, 6. Okay, so we have to say that because that's C, D, G, even though it happens on the downbeat, that doesn't make a triad of any kind. That cannot be the chord. So that C has to be a non-chord tone. Okay, and so in this case, it's going to be a 2-3 suspension, and it works in the same way, even though it's in the bass. That first C, which is part of the first chord, that C major chord, is the preparation, which then becomes a suspension when it's repeated, and then resolves down by step to become the third, the note of resolution. Now, this is the only kind of suspension that has numbers that go from small to bigger, right? So from 2 to 3. All the other ones have gotten smaller as they've resolved. But when it's in the bass, it actually expands, becomes bigger. Okay. And then finally we have one more type of non-chord tone, and it's sort of like the opposite of a suspension. We call it a retardation. And a retardation is just like a suspension. It's created when a note from the previous chord is held over or repeated, but retardations always resolve up by step instead of down by step. So they're like suspensions, but they resolve in the opposite direction. So here we're doubling up. We have 2 retardations at the same time. And let me play this for you. One more time. So this one, like I said, we have 2 retardations on top of each other, which can happen sometimes. Same with all the other ones too, by the way. So here we have our first one, which is a 9 to 10, in this case, retardation. So that G in the 5 chord is the preparation. Then that G gets repeated in the tenor, and that G does not belong in that chord because that chord should be F, A, C. That G does not belong. So that is our retardation in this case. And then that resolves up by step to become the third of the chord, or the 10th. So we call that a 9-10 retardation. Then there's another one happening at the same time. That E is the preparation note in the soprano, which then gets repeated and becomes a note that is dissonant with that harmony, right? Doesn't belong in the chord. So that's our 7 above the note F, which then resolves up by step to become the octave. So we call that a 7-8 retardation. I'll play this one more time. And again, they're not eighth notes because they don't have to be eighth notes. All that matters is that they happen at the same time as whatever chord we think we have there, right? So in this case, we have an F major chord, a 1 chord, that lasts for a half note. So our non-chord tones could be eighth notes, but they can also be shorter or longer than eighth notes because we have that much time to have notes that do not belong in the chord, right? So in this case, even though these are quarter notes, because we're not changing a harmony every quarter note, we're only keeping harmony for a half note, then those quarter notes can be non-chord tones. Okay, there you go, 4 kinds of non-chord tones. Hope that was helpful. We'll be doing much more of this and applying it in our Zoom session. And yeah, thanks for watching. Hope you guys have a great day.